There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when everything he has built with his hands is taken away. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a world that has decided you no longer matter, a silence that presses against your chest like a hand, steady, deliberate, and cold. Marcus James Beaumont knew that silence well. He had first heard it as a boy, standing in the doorway of his family's two-bedroom house in Pratt City, Alabama, watching his father sit at the kitchen table with a letter in his hand and nothing on his face. His father, a man who had worked the same coal route for 19 years, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the earth's darkness, had just been told that the mine was closing. That Tuesday morning in 1987, a 6-year-old Marcus watched something leave his father's eyes. He didn't have the words for it then. He would spend the next 4 decades searching for them. His father never fully came back from that Tuesday. He found other work, odd jobs, a janitorial position at the local school, some seasonal lumber work 2 counties over. But the man who used to whistle while cooking Sunday breakfast, who used to carry Marcus on his shoulders through the county fair like he was showing off the greatest treasure in the world, that man slowly, quietly disappeared. What remained was a shell that wore his father's face and spoke in shorter sentences and laughed a little less each year. Marcus decided early that this would not be his story. He was not naive enough to believe the world was fair. Growing up black in rural Alabama in the 80s and 90s taught you that lesson in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes brutally direct. He understood, even as a teenager, that the deck was stacked in ways that had nothing to do with talent or effort. But understanding a thing and surrendering to it are 2 entirely different choices, and Marcus Beaumont was not built for surrender. He was an average student, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the school was underfunded, his textbooks were outdated, and by 16 he was working evenings at a gas station to help his mother keep the lights on. What Marcus lacked in formal academic achievement, he made up for in a quality that cannot be taught in any classroom. He knew how to read people. He could walk into a room and within minutes understand who held the real power, who was afraid, who was performing, and who was genuine. His mother called it a gift. His high school principal called it an attitude. Decades later, his political opponents would call it dangerous. At 18, Marcus had 2 options in front of him, the military or the mill. He chose the mill. Southeastern Steel Works sat on the eastern edge of Pratt City like an iron cathedral, massive, loud, perpetually exhaling smoke into the Alabama sky. It employed 1,247 people from 5 surrounding counties. It had been operating for 62 years. It was the reason the town had a grocery store, a decent elementary school, a diner that could afford to stay open past 8, and a modest but functioning sense of community dignity. Marcus started on the floor crew at $11.40 an hour. He wore steel-toed boots that his uncle handed down, a hard hat with a crack along the back that he covered with electrical tape, and he showed up 17 minutes early every single shift for the first 3 months. Not because anyone told him to, but because he had watched his father lose everything and he had made a private vow that no one would ever find reason to dismiss him easily. The work was hard in the truest sense of the word, not the polished, cinematic version of hard work you see in movies. This was real hard, the kind that puts a constant dull ache in your lower back by the time you're 30, that leaves your ears ringing for hours after a shift, that coats your skin in a fine layer of metallic residue no matter how long you shower. The kind of hard that slowly rearranges your body without asking permission. But Marcus loved it. He loved the brotherhood of it, the unspoken code among the men on the floor, the way a nod communicated what a paragraph could not. He loved the straightforwardness. You worked, the steel moved, the product existed. There was a visible result to your effort. In a world that often felt abstract and arbitrary, the mill was honest. It gave back what you put in. Within 5 years, Marcus had moved from floor crew to line supervisor. Within 10, he was shift manager, one of only 3 black shift managers in the plant's history, a fact that the company noted in a framed photo on the wall and promptly forgot about in every other meaningful way. By his 32nd birthday, Marcus James Beaumont had been at Southeastern Steel Works for 14 years. He had married Diane, a schoolteacher with a laugh that could make a funeral feel like a birthday party. They had 2 daughters, Kezia, who was 9, and little Amara, who was 5 and already convinced she was going to be the President of the United States. They owned a modest 3-bedroom house on Callaway Street, nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They had a mortgage. They had a savings account with 4 months of emergency funds, a figure Marcus tracked with almost religious discipline. They had a small backyard where Marcus had planted a vegetable garden that his mother called the most ambitious thing a Beaumont man has ever grown. It was not wealth, but it was stability, and for a man who had watched his father buckle under the weight of its absence, stability felt like abundance. Then came the Tuesday. It was not just any Tuesday. It was October 14th, a morning with clear blue sky and a faint chill that suggested autumn was finally serious about arriving. Marcus had driven to work listening to a gospel station, humming along, thinking about whether he had enough time to fix the leaking gutter before the weekend rain. He was thinking about gutters when his entire life turned. The announcement came at 7:45 in the morning, before the second shift had even fully clocked in. The plant manager, a man named Gerald Hooper, who wore company-issued khakis and had never once in 12 years asked Marcus's daughter's names, stood in the main floor break room and read from a sheet of paper without looking up. Southeastern Steelworks would be closing permanently in 90 days. The company had been acquired the previous year by a private equity firm based in Connecticut. The firm had reviewed the asset portfolio and determined that consolidating operations overseas, primarily to facilities in Vietnam and Bangladesh, would produce a 23% increase in annual returns for shareholders. The Alabama plant, despite 62 years of operation and 1,247 jobs, was no longer financially optimal. Gerald Hooper finished reading from his paper. He folded it. He said he was sorry. He did not look up once. The room was completely silent. Marcus stood in the back near the coffee machine. He was 52 years old. He had given 22 years to this plant. He was 3 years away from full pension vesting. He looked around the room at the faces of the men he had worked beside, laughed with, argued with, celebrated birthdays and retirements with. Big Earl, who had 6 months left before his own pension vested. Ramon, who had just bought his first house. Darnell, who had a son with cerebral palsy and relied on the company health insurance like oxygen. Marcus watched Gerald Hooper walk out of the room without taking any questions. He looked down at his coffee cup. He looked at his hands. He thought about his father sitting at that kitchen table in 1987 with a letter and nothing on his face. And he felt something move inside him, not the grief he expected, not the panic, but something harder and older and more dangerous than either of those. He felt fury. Not the hot, flailing fury of a man caught off guard. This was cold fury, the kind that does not scream, the kind that calculates. He drove home that afternoon. They sent the shift managers home early, which struck him as both a kindness and an insult, and he sat in his driveway for 23 minutes before going inside. Deanne was at school, the girls were at school. The house was quiet. He walked to the kitchen table, the same configuration his father had once sat at, the same posture, the same weight in the room, and he placed his hard hat on the table in front of him. He sat there for a long time. Then he picked up a yellow legal pad that Diane used for her lesson plans, and he wrote one question at the top of the page. What do I actually have the power to do? It was the most important question of his life. In the weeks that followed, the community of Pratt City grieved the way small communities grieve industrial death, slowly, unevenly. With long silences at dinner tables and arguments that were really fear in disguise. The local diner started closing at 5 instead of 8. The grocery store began stocking fewer specialty items. A quiet panic moved through the town like a slow-moving weather system, not dramatic enough to make the news, just steady and suffocating. Marcus threw himself into organizing. He had never used that word before. He hadn't studied labor history. He had no formal training in community organizing or political theory. What he had was 22 years of knowing exactly how these 1,247 people operated, what they feared, what they valued, what they needed to hear, and in what order. He started holding meetings in his living room. The first meeting had 7 people: Big Earl, Ramon, Darnell, 3 women from the administrative floor who had been invisible in every official capacity but who knew where every body was buried in that company, and a retired pastor named Reverend Otis Chambers who had been attending every crisis in Pratt City for 30 years and who told Marcus on the way in the door, "I've been waiting for someone to do something. I was starting to think it would have to be me." They talked for 4 hours. They talked about severance packages that were legally insufficient. They talked about the pension fund, specifically the alarming irregularities that one of the administrative women, a sharp and quiet woman named Beverly who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had noticed in the quarterly reports for the past 2 years. They talked about the fact that not a single local or state official had issued a public statement. Marcus wrote everything down. Within 3 weeks, the meetings had moved from his living room to the church hall on 2nd Street, 60 people, then 100, then the meetings spilled out into the parking lot. Marcus was not a natural public speaker, not yet. His early addresses were earnest but unpolished, sometimes too quiet, sometimes running long. But there was something in his delivery that commanded a room in a way that technique alone never could. He spoke from a specific, located, real place. He was not performing outrage. He was presenting it carefully and clearly like evidence, and people felt the difference. Diane watched him in those early months with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't just pride, it was something more searching than that, as if she was seeing a version of her husband she had suspected existed but had never seen emerge. One night after a particularly long meeting, she sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "You know this isn't enough, organizing is good, but you need to be in the room where the decisions are actually made." Marcus looked at her. She said, "You need to run for city council." He laughed, the genuine, surprised laugh of a man who has just been told something he thinks is absurd. She didn't laugh back. He filed for city council in January, 4 months after the plant closure announcement. The filing fee was $150, which he paid with money from their emergency savings fund and immediately replaced the following week. He had no campaign manager, no political connections, no donor list. He had a folding table, a stack of flyers he designed himself on Diane's school computer, and the phone numbers of everyone who had attended the church hall meetings. The incumbent was a man named Councilman Douglas Pritchard, a pleasant, ineffective man who had held the seat for 11 years by being objectionable to no one. He had a campaign office, a donor network, and the institutional endorsement of the County Democratic Party, which trusted known quantities above unknown challengers. Marcus knocked on every door in his district, not his volunteers him. He believed that if he was asking someone to trust him with their representation, the least he could do was look them in the eye personally and ask. He wore out 2 pairs of shoes in 3 months. He spoke at every church, every civic meeting, every school board gathering that would have him. He showed up to events he wasn't invited to and introduced himself anyway. He lost by 340 votes. He drove home on election night and sat at the kitchen table. He had developed a habit of processing things at that table, as if the wood itself held some steady authority, and he stared at the results printout for a long time. Kezia, who was now 11 and had inherited her mother's directness, came and sat across from him. She put her chin in her hand and studied his face. "Are you quitting?" she asked. "No," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to bed. He ran again 2 years later. He won by 612 votes. He was 55 years old when he took his seat on the Pratt City Council. To some people, that was a late start. To Marcus, it was exactly on time, because he arrived not as a political theorist or an idealist or a career seeker, but as a man who had worked 22 years in a steel mill, who understood precisely what it cost when institutions failed working people, and who had spent 2 years learning how power actually operated in the spaces most people never see. He was the most prepared first-term council member anyone in Pratt City could remember. He immediately requested access to every contract the city had with state and federal regulatory bodies. He spent evenings, often past midnight, while Diane graded papers at the same table, reading legislation, municipal code, regulatory frameworks. He taught himself the language of power the same way he had once taught himself to read a mill production schedule, methodically, without pride, focused entirely on utility. Beverly, the sharp woman with the reading glasses who had first flagged the pension irregularities, had become his de facto policy researcher. She was brilliant in a way that had been systematically underutilized her entire career, and she approached municipal documents with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. Within his first term, Marcus had done 4 things of note. He had forced an independent audit of the Southeastern Steelworks Pension Fund, which revealed that the private equity firm had underfunded the pension by $4.2 million in the 2 years before the closure, a finding that eventually led to a partial federal recovery of benefits for 340 workers. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was real. Earl got more of his pension than he would have without the fight. He had partnered with the state community college system to establish a retraining program for displaced workers. Negotiating the funding himself through a combination of federal grant applications he had researched personally and a corporate partnership with a logistics company considering a facility near the county. He had passed an ordinance requiring that any business receiving city development incentives above $50,000 maintain a minimum percentage of local hires for at least 7 years, a provision specifically designed to prevent exactly what Southeastern Steel had done. And he had begun quietly meeting with the families of the 11 men and women who had died in industrial accidents at the plant over the previous 2 decades, reviewing their cases, and compiling a report on the safety violations the company had internally documented, addressed internally, and never reported to regulators. That report would eventually travel far beyond Pratt City. His city council seat led, 3 years later, to a seat in the Alabama state legislature. He ran on a platform that was simple and almost stubbornly specific. Working people deserve representation by people who have worked. He did not traffic in abstract ideology. He talked about pension security, workplace safety, healthcare costs, and the economic mechanics of what happens when a company extracts decades of labor from a community and then departs without consequence. He talked about these things in precise, concrete terms, with real numbers and real names. He lost his first state legislative race by 1,100 votes. He ran again 2 years later. He won by 2,800. The Alabama State House was a different world. More money, more calculation, more performances of power. Marcus arrived and was largely ignored, a grey-haired former factory worker with no legal degree, no family political legacy, and an inexplicable habit of showing up to committee meetings with binders of research that nobody else had read. Senior members were cordial in the way that institutions are cordial to people they do not consider threats. They would eventually reconsider. Marcus made the State House uncomfortable in a specific way. He was always prepared. In a chamber where many members relied on staff briefings and talking points, Marcus read the primary source documents. When colleagues cited corporate testimony in committee hearings, Marcus cited the footnotes in those corporations' own SEC filings. He had no interest in winning arguments through rhetoric. He wanted to win them through facts that could not be spun or dismissed. He developed unexpected alliances. A Republican rancher from Northwest Alabama named Tillman Hayes, a big, red-faced man who had initially dismissed Marcus as a liberal agitator, ended up becoming one of his most reliable partners on agricultural and rural economic policy, after discovering that Marcus knew more about the farm credit system than almost anyone in the building. They disagreed on a great deal. They agreed on the things that mattered most to the people neither of them intended to leave behind. Diane watched all of it from Pratt City, where she continued teaching. They had talked about her moving with him during legislative sessions, but she had students she wasn't willing to abandon mid-year, a classroom she had built over decades into a genuine sanctuary for kids who needed one. Marcus drove home every weekend that the legislature wasn't in emergency session. Those Friday evening drives, 140 miles back to the house on Callaway Street, the vegetable garden, the kitchen table, were the resets that kept him from losing himself in the marble corridors of Montgomery. Amara, their younger daughter, had graduated from Howard University with a degree in political science. She had come back to Alabama to work on her father's campaigns, first reluctantly, insisting she was only helping temporarily, and then with a ferocity that suggested she had found her own calling in the work. The little girl who had announced at 5 that she would be president had refined her ambitions only slightly. She was running her father's growing political operation with a strategic precision that left senior consultants quietly impressed and occasionally threatened. Marcus's state legislative record, over 6 years, built something that quiet and unglamorous work always builds eventually, a reputation that travels on its own. When the incumbent U.S. Senator from Alabama, a man who had held the seat for 18 years and who had, coincidentally, been one of the legislators most aggressively supportive of the deregulation policies that had made the Southeastern steel closure legally simple, announced he would not seek re-election due to health concerns, the landscape shifted. A dozen names immediately circulated as potential candidates. Marcus's name was not among them, not in the first week, not in the early establishment conversations, not in the donor discussions that happened in Atlanta and Washington over lunch at restaurants Marcus had never been to and would never seek out. His name came from somewhere else. It came from Beverly, who had by now built a statewide coalition of labor and community organizations that existed largely outside the traditional political structure. It came from the retraining program graduates, hundreds of former mill workers, and manufacturing employees who had rebuilt their lives with assistance that Marcus had fought to create and protect. It came from Pastor Otis Chambers, who was 81 years old now, and who delivered a sermon one Sunday that was not technically about Marcus, but was entirely about the kind of man Alabama needed in Washington. And it came from Tillman Hayes, of all people, who called 3 of his Republican colleagues and said, without editorial, that Marcus Beaumont was the most prepared person he had seen in 20 years of politics, and that he was going to do something unexpected with that preparation. Marcus came home on a Friday evening in March. He found Diane in the kitchen, making the gumbo she made when she had something important to say and needed the comfort of a familiar task to frame it. He sat at the table. He looked at the yellow legal pad that still lived in the drawer to his left, different pads by now but always yellow, always legal-sized. "You're thinking about the Senate race," Diane said, not looking up from the pot. "I'm thinking about whether I have any business thinking about it," he said. She set the spoon down. She turned around. Diane Beaumont was 58 years old, with silver threading through her hair and the eyes of a woman who has spent 30 years watching children discover they are capable of more than they believed. She looked at her husband for a moment. "Marcus," she said, "you've been preparing for this since you were 6 years old. You just didn't know it yet." He thought about his father at the kitchen table. He thought about Gerald Hooper reading from his paper without looking up. He thought about Big Earl, who had ultimately received a partial pension settlement and who now volunteered at the Workforce Retraining Center on Thursdays. He thought about Darnell's son, who had aged off his father's company insurance at 26 and spent 3 terrifying months uninsured before a policy Marcus had fought for in the state legislature expanded a coverage window that caught him. He pulled out the yellow legal pad. He wrote, "What do I actually have the power to do?" The same question. It always came back to the same question. He filed for the US Senate in April. The campaign was unlike anything Marcus had attempted before. Not simply in scale, though the scale was staggering, an entire state instead of a council district, but in the quality of opposition he now faced. He was running in a primary against 4 candidates, 3 of whom had significant self-funding capacity, established donor networks, and the kind of smooth, camera-ready political presence that telegraphed establishment comfort. Marcus had none of those things. What he had was a ground game that Beverly had been quietly building for 8 years across every county in Alabama, and the moral authority that comes from having done real things for real people in public view. You cannot manufacture that authority. It either exists or it doesn't. And increasingly, as the campaign traveled across the state, voters felt the difference between someone who was performing concern and someone who had been inside the specific grief of economic loss and had chosen to fight rather than to console. He also had Amara. His younger daughter ran the campaign with the kind of controlled ferocity that made experienced political operatives pay attention. She had inherited her mother's laugh and her father's cold fury, and she deployed both with remarkable timing. She was 31 years old and had developed, over years of working in her father's various campaigns, a gift for understanding what a moment required. When the campaign needed warmth, she created warmth. When it needed sharpness, she provided sharpness. When the establishment tried to ignore them, she engineered situations where ignoring them was not an option. The primary fight was grueling. One of Marcus's opponents, a state attorney general named Caldwell, with expensive suits and a background in corporate law, ran an ad that described Marcus as a union agitator with no qualifications for federal office. Marcus's response was not an attack ad. It was a town hall meeting in Caldwell's home county, where Marcus spent 2 hours answering questions from local farmers and small business owners about trade policy, agricultural subsidies, and rural broadband infrastructure. He had read everything. He knew the specific numbers for every county. He answered questions that most Senate candidates would have deflected with talking points. The video of that town hall was shared 40,000 times before the campaign had spent a single dollar on digital promotion. He won the primary by 11 points. The general election was what national political commentators later called improbable. Alabama had voted for the same party in Senate races for most of the preceding 3 decades. The conventional wisdom said Marcus couldn't win. The polling said it was close. The party establishment invested cautiously, hedging against the possibility of a loss they didn't want to be associated with. Marcus spent the final 6 weeks of the campaign doing the only thing he knew. He went to the doors. Not just the friendly doors, all the doors. He knocked on doors in counties where he expected to lose. He sat in diners where every other person in the room had probably voted for his opponent before Marcus had even announced his candidacy. He ate bad pie and drank bad coffee and looked people in the eye and talked about the things that were actually making their lives harder. He didn't change his positions to do it. He just talked about them in the language of specificity, names of bills, line items in budgets, the concrete mechanics of how policy actually lands on actual people. He won by 4 points. On election night, Marcus James Beaumont, a man who had washed his first steel mill protective gear in a break room sink at 18 years old, who had lost 2 elections before winning his first, who had taught himself legislation the way he had once taught himself production schedules, gave his victory speech in the gymnasium of the same elementary school where his father had once worked as a janitor after the mine closed. He had chosen the location deliberately. He stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd, at Beverly, who was crying behind her reading glasses, at Reverend Chambers, who had driven 4 hours at 81 years old and was clapping with the steady, satisfied energy of a man whose long prayer had finally been answered, at Tillman Hayes, who stood in the back with his arms crossed and his chin up, nodding with a slow, deliberate approval that was, from Tillman Hayes, roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. At Big Earl, who had lost 30 pounds since the mill, but whose eyes were the same warm and steady light they had always been. At Diane, who stood in the front row and did not cry, because Diane Beaumont did not cry at victories. She saved her tears for the hard nights. For the victory nights she had something better, a look of such complete and settled pride that Marcus had to pause for a moment before he began to speak, because looking at her was too full a thing to hold while simultaneously trying to form words. At Amara, standing next to her mother, 31 years old, the girl who had said at 5 she would be president, who was right now perhaps the most talented political operator in the state of Alabama, and who Marcus knew with the bone-deep certainty of a parent, was just beginning. He looked at all of them. He looked at the gymnasium. He thought about his father's hands, permanently stained with coal dust. He thought about Gerald Hooper reading from his paper without looking up. He thought about the Tuesday. He leaned into the microphone. "I am not going to tell you tonight that this is a victory for me," he said. "I've had victories. I know what they feel like. They feel small. A council seat is a small thing. A state house seat is a small thing. Even this, even tonight, is a small thing if we measure it by what still needs to be done." The crowd had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that forms around a voice that is saying something true. "I know what it costs when a company takes 22 years of your life and hands you a final check on a Tuesday," he said. "I know what it looks like when a man's sense of worth gets extracted from him along with his paycheck. I watched it happen to my father. I almost let it happen to me." He paused. "The difference between what happened to my father and what happened to me," he said slowly, "was not talent. It was not luck. The difference was that someone, a room full of someones, decided that losing together was worse than giving up alone, that they would not accept a silence that told them they didn't matter." He let that sit for a moment. "I am going to Washington," he said, "to make sure that the people who handed you that check on a Tuesday have to look up when they do it." The gymnasium erupted. He was sworn into the United States Senate on a January morning, a day with clear blue sky, and a cold that bit at the ears and fingers of the people gathered on the Capitol steps. Diane stood beside him. Amara stood behind him. Beverly had flown in the night before and was standing somewhere in the crowd, almost certainly already reading something on her phone about upcoming committee assignments. In the months that followed, Marcus did what no one quite expected. He was patient. He did not arrive in the Senate seeking the spotlight. He did not seek cable news appearances or viral moments. He requested assignment to the Commerce Committee and the Labor Committee, positions that offered little glamour and enormous opportunity to actually affect the policies he cared about. He read every bill. He met with every constituent group that requested time. He hired a staff that was younger and more diverse than any Senate office on his corridor, and he told them on the first day that he expected to be the most prepared person in any room he walked into, and that meant they needed to be the most prepared staff in the building. He introduced his first piece of major legislation 8 months into his first term. It was called the Industrial Community Protection Act, a bill that would require private equity acquisitions of companies with over 500 employees to establish a mandatory community impact fund, contribute to local pension security, provide a minimum of 2 years advance notice before facility closures, and face meaningful federal penalties for regulatory evasion in the years preceding closures. It was not glamorous legislation. It did not have a name that fit easily on a bumper sticker. It drew almost no national media attention in its first iteration. It also had 3 co-sponsors on introduction, including one Republican from the Midwest, a former auto worker himself, who had read the bill carefully and called Marcus directly to say he had been waiting for someone to write it. By the end of the first year, it had 11 co-sponsors. The private equity industry spent $8 million lobbying against it. Marcus found this clarifying. He framed it as the most useful endorsement the bill had received. The fight for the legislation would take years. Marcus knew this going in and made peace with it before he filed the paperwork. Real structural change, the kind that actually rearranges how power operates rather than simply adjusting its aesthetics, moves through American institutions the way water moves through limestone, slowly, persistently, and ultimately with absolute force. He went home to Pratt City on the weekends that he could. He still sat at the kitchen table. The vegetable garden in the backyard had grown more elaborate over the years. His mother had been right about the ambition of Beaumont men in gardens, if nothing else. He grew tomatoes and peppers and collard greens, and inexplicably, a small section of lavender that Diane had requested, and that Marcus tended with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything. He still kept yellow legal pads in the drawer to his left. He still wrote the same question when the weight of what he was trying to do pressed too hard against his chest. What do I actually have the power to do? There is a story we tell ourselves about how change happens in America. It is a story of dramatic moments, great speeches on great steps, singular heroes with singular visions, righteous anger that moves mountains in a single emotional surge. It is a story that is sometimes true, but it is not the only story. There is another story. It is less cinematic. It moves more slowly and asks more of the people inside it. It requires a particular kind of person, not the kind who is built for the spotlight's comfort, but the kind who is built for the long, unglamorous corridor between what is and what should be. It requires the kind of person who watches his father lose everything at a kitchen table and decides, at 6 years old, that this will not be the whole story. It requires the kind of person who loses his job at 52 and asks not why did this happen, but what do I actually have the power to do? It requires the kind of person who loses an election and whose 11-year-old daughter asks, "Are you quitting?" and who says no, not as performance, but as simple and accurate statement of fact. It requires the kind of person who knocks on every door, who reads every document, who builds alliances with people he disagrees with because the work is more important than the comfort of only working with people who already agree. Marcus James Beaumont was 61 years old when he stood on the floor of the United States Senate and delivered his argument for the Industrial Community Protection Act during a procedural vote that would determine whether it moved to full floor consideration. The speech lasted 40 minutes. He did not use notes. He spoke about his father. He spoke about Gerald Hooper and the folded piece of paper and the eyes that never looked up. He spoke about Big Earl and Ramon and Darnell and Beverly, and every name he could put to the cost of what happened when power operated without accountability. He was not eloquent in the trained, classical sense. He was something rarer. He was specific. Every story he told was a real story. Every number he cited had a human face behind it that he had personally looked at. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Tillman Hayes, who was now a United States Senator himself, having won his own unlikely race 2 years after Marcus, stood from his desk and began to applaud. He was the first. He was not the last. The bill passed committee. It went to full floor vote. The road to becoming law was still long. Conference with the House, presidential consideration, the inevitable attempts at amendment and dilution that powerful industries deploy when they cannot kill a bill outright. Marcus knew all of this. He had read enough legislative history to understand that the passage of a bill is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of the enforcement. But on the day the bill passed its first Senate vote, Marcus called Diane from his Senate office. It was late afternoon. The light through the window was the amber color of a thing ending. "It passed committee," he said. A silence on the line. The comfortable, weighted silence between two people who have been through enough together. That silence carries meaning. "How many votes?" she asked. 14-7, he said. She exhaled. "Come home this weekend." "I will," he said. "The lavender needs attention," she said. He laughed, the genuine, surprised laugh of a man who has just been reminded of the right proportion of things. He went home that weekend. He sat at the kitchen table. He tended the lavender. He drove Diane to dinner at the same diner where 12 years earlier he had eaten alone after the community meeting where 7 people first gathered in his living room to decide they would not accept silence. The diner was still open. It stayed open past 8 now. The grocery store in town had expanded its produce section. The Workforce Retraining Center on the other side of town had graduated its 14th cohort of displaced workers. Beverly ran it now, officially, with 3 full-time staff and a waiting list. Reverend Chambers had passed the previous spring, 83 years old, a full life, a good death, the kind of exit that feels like completion rather than loss. Marcus had given the eulogy. He had talked about the first meeting in the church hall, and the old pastor standing in the doorway saying he'd been waiting for someone to do something. The vegetable garden in the backyard was producing. Pratt City was not saved. Let nobody be romantic about that. The plant was gone. Some families had never fully recovered. Some people had left and not come back. The town was smaller than it had been on that Tuesday in October 12 years ago, and it would probably be smaller still in another decade. Economic geography is not kind, and the forces that had moved that plant overseas were not undone by a single man's Senate career. But the town was not defeated. The town had someone in Washington who knew its name, not as a statistic, but as a collection of specific people with specific lives and specific claims on dignity that Marcus James Beaumont had not forgotten and did not intend to forget. That is not everything. But it is not nothing either. There is a kind of work in this world that does not get a monument or a film or a clean, satisfying ending neatly tied. There is a kind of work that is just work, relentless, incremental, often invisible, done by people who showed up when they could have left, who ran again when they could have stopped, who asked what they had the power to do and then did it again tomorrow. Marcus James Beaumont was not a symbol. He was a man who lost his job at 52, who watched his father's back break under the weight of a system that treated people as inputs and discarded them as inefficiencies. He was a man who sat at a kitchen table and refused, quietly, completely, without performance, to accept that the silence meant what it wanted him to believe it meant. That he was invisible. That it was over. That there was nothing left to do. He was wrong about none of that. And if there is a lesson in his story, not a bumper sticker, not a slogan, but an actual lesson, the kind that costs something and therefore sticks, it is this. The system is designed to make you feel like your moment has passed, like your start was too late, like the opposition is too large and too funded and too entrenched for one person working from a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad to make any meaningful dent. The system is often right about many things. It is wrong about that. It has always been wrong about that. Your Tuesday will come. The call, the letter, the folded piece of paper, the announcement in the break room from a man who cannot look up. The moment when everything you built with your hands is handed back to you in a sealed envelope. The question, the only question that has ever mattered, is not why did this happen? The question is, what do I actually have the power to do? Pick up the legal pad. Write it down. Then begin.